So welcome everybody to this AJBCC webinar, the first of a number in the second half of the calendar year and the beginning of the financial year here in Australia. It's good that so many of you are able to join us. Let me start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people, the traditional owners of the land I'm in at the moment, here in Melbourne, of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their leaders past, present and emerging. The session this morning, and I'll hand over to Andrew in a moment to run it, but the session this morning is to look at JAEPA, the Japan-Australia Economic Partnership Agreement, signed several years ago and which built so well on the commercial agreement that was signed in 1957, which underpinned the extraordinarily strong trading relationship between Japan and Australia. That relationship is stronger than ever and more important than ever. But as we did 12 months after the JAEPA document was signed, it's an opportunity to review where we are, what's worked and what hasn't worked, and more importantly, what else we can do. I think we all agree it's been a considerable step forward, but as always, the question of what more we could do is important. So having welcomed you all, let me hand over to fellow committee member from the AJBCC, who you all know so well, Andrew Parker, who'll run the session for us. Andrew, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Rod, and good morning to everybody. Yeah, Sir Rod said, I've often wondered about the courage that it must have taken back in 1957 when Australia became the first nation to open its doors to trade with Japan, which was barely a decade after the end of World War II. But it's turned out to be an extraordinarily good decision for both of our countries. The bilateral relationship continues to grow, and half a century after the Menzies government entered into that commerce agreement that Sir Rod mentioned, negotiations started under the Howard government in 2007 and were eventually concluded in 2014 with JAEPA coming into effect in 2015. So Japan has been a great partner for Australia and a really strong supporter of the multilateral rules-based system that has served us all so well, in Australia particularly well. Perhaps the best illustration of that was the work that was done by Japan and Australia to rescue the TPP when the US withdrew back in 2017. We're really fortunate to have two outstanding speakers with us this morning as we review the Japan-Australia Economic Partnership Agreement and our trade relationship with Japan. Elisabeth Bowes is a Senior Trade Negotiator from DFAT, and she's going to provide some perspectives on JAEPA and the upcoming review that Sir Rod mentioned. And then Brett Cooper, who is one of our most experienced trade commissioners, is going to offer some observations on taking advantage of JAEPA on the ground in Japan. After we have heard from Elisabeth and Brett, there's going to be some time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function. Ask you please to use the Q&A function and not the chat function in Zoom. And we'll do our best to get through all of those questions for you. So let me talk to our first speaker now, Elisabeth Bowes. Elisabeth is one of our most experienced trade negotiators. She was appointed Chief Negotiator in the Regional Trade Agreements Division in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in January of 2020 and is now and recently appointed as First Secretary in May 2020 as well. Prior to that, Elisabeth was Assistant Secretary, Trade and Investment Law Branch in the Office of Trade Negotiators at DFAT and Minister Counsellor at the Australian Embassy in Washington, DC, where she oversaw bilateral trade relationships between the US and Australia, as well as broader trade policy issues. Elisabeth was also the head of the Tobacco Plain Packaging Task Force in DFAT, where she led Australia's defence of its world first tobacco plain packaging measure in dispute settlement procedures in the WTO. She was also posted as counsellor to the Australian Permanent Mission to the WTO in Geneva, where she was responsible for WTO dispute settlement and trade environment negotiations. And before joining DFAT, Elisabeth was a legal specialist at the United Nations Compensation Commission in Geneva and a legal officer at the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea in Hamburg. So a vastly experienced diplomat. So Elisabeth, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that very kind introduction, and also to Sir Rod for the overview and opening of today's proceedings. It really is a pleasure for me to be able to speak to members of the Australia-Japan Business Cooperation Committee today. And I would note this is the first time that I've had the privilege of addressing the committee. So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to working more closely with all of you and other stakeholders to progress the general review of JAEPA in a way that enhances our trade and investment relationship with Japan, and that will also deliver improved opportunities for business, including for the members of the AJBCC. But before I do go into the details of JAEPA and the general review, I just wanted to briefly outline the significance of Australia's relationship with Japan, which indeed Andrew and Sir Rod have already touched upon. But in particular, I'd really like to highlight that at a time of increasing global strategic competition, the value of our special strategic partnership with Japan has never been greater. It is based on strong trade and economic ties and has matured into one of our closest and most reliable in Asia. This partnership is fundamentally important to our mutual strategic and economic interests. And certainly Andrew has highlighted the close cooperation that we have with Japan in both the CPTPP, the new incarnation of the TPPPP, as well as the WTO. Together, we are charting the course of regional recovery from COVID-19, including by supporting open trade and health outcomes, particularly through access to vaccines. And I would note that most recently, Prime Minister Morrison met with Japanese Prime Minister Suga in the margins of the G7 in the United Kingdom and announced a partnership of decarbonisation through technology. Now, this announcement builds upon other initiatives that we have agreed, particularly in the energy and resources sectors, including for the hydrogen energy supply chain, the Japan-Australia Energy and Resources Dialogue, and the Australia-Japan Joint Statement of Cooperation on Hydrogen and Fuel Cells. And indeed, Japan has been a very significant investor in the development of our resources sector. Australia's largest export industries, including LNG, iron ore and coal, have indeed benefited and developed with the benefit of Japanese investment. And despite COVID-19 challenges, Japan remains a strong market for established commodities, including LNG, coal, iron ore, beef, copper, sugar, dairy products, grains, and medical instruments, among others. Japan is now our third largest trading partner in goods and services after China and the United States, and our second largest export market after China, as well as our third largest source of imports after China and the United States. So really an incredibly important bilateral trade and economic relationship. Japan is also our largest source of investment from Asia and our fourth largest source of investment overall. Importantly, Japan is our second largest source of foreign direct investment after the United States, accounting for 12.8% of total FDI. And this represents almost a 70% increase since the entry into force of JAEPA. Japan is also our fourth largest destination for foreign investment, and this has increased by more than 50% since entry into force of JAEPA. Australia and Japan are continuing to work together to support open economic growth, as Andrew mentioned, through the multilateral trading system, the WTO, and through other international economic organisations, including the G20 and APEC. And we are also working closely together to implement our regional trade agreements. We've already mentioned the CPTPP, and indeed Japan is hosting the CPTPP this year. But also we are working together on implementation of the Regional and Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which we expect to enter into force later this year. Now, turning to the JAEPA General Review, as you all know, JAEPA entered into force in early 2015, and it is already delivering enduring significant benefits for Australian and Japanese businesses and consumers. But it is important to ensure that the agreement is kept up to date and current, particularly as global trade and investment patterns change and as new trade agreements enter into force. The General Review, which is a requirement under the agreement, provides an opportunity for Australia and Japan to upgrade and modernise the agreement to support our enhanced bilateral economic partnership. The General Review provides a framework to identify trade and investment policy opportunities, review FTA activities, and consider emerging developments in global trade policy more broadly. The review will also need to consider Japan's interests, and any improved potential benefits for Australia will need to be negotiated and potentially will require trade-offs and similar levels of ambition from both countries. So in short, it is a negotiation. Ultimately, any outcomes from the General Review will need to be mutually beneficial and mutually agreed for both Australia and Japan. Now, we are at the very start of a general review of JAEPA, and that's why this webinar is particularly timely. We have put out a call for written submissions from businesses and other interested stakeholders on the DFAT website. The deadline for making those submissions is currently 15 July, but we are looking at extending it into August. So I would encourage all of those online, if you export or undertake business between Australia and Japan, to put in a submission outlining your views on how JAEPA could be upgraded. What could the General Review actually look at? Now, this is not the first time we've undertaken a review of an FTA to which we are party. And indeed, many of our FTAs do contain general or indeed specific review mechanisms. We have undertaken general reviews of existing FTAs before, notably including with Singapore and our agreement with ASEAN and New Zealand, ANZFTA. As a result of the third review of the Singapore-Australia Free Trade Agreement, the agreement was amended most recently in 2016, in particular by upgrading a number of chapters in the agreement to reflect what was then very recent outcomes in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And in fact, I would note that those provisions came into force and reflected TPP outcomes before the CPTPP actually came into force. So we're of mutual benefit for both Australia and Singapore. Most recently, we conducted the review of the SAFTA e-commerce chapter, and this resulted in the negotiation of the Australia-Singapore Digital Economy Agreement, which entered into force in December 2020. Reviews have also provided new market access, particularly for professional services and the mutual recognition of qualifications and licensing in the accounting and engineering professions. Australia and other parties to ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand FTA have undertaken one upgrade since it entered into force in 2010, and we are currently in negotiations with ANZFTA parties on another upgrade of that agreement, which we expect to take place over the next 2 years. So they're just some examples of the reviews and the resulting upgrades that have taken place with our existing FTAs. For the JAEPA General Review, we will take into account outcomes agreed with Japan subsequent to the negotiation and entry into force of JAEPA, such as outcomes in the CPTPP and RCEP. Now, the CPTPP in particular set a new high standard as a trade agreement for the region and already achieves improved outcomes for both Australia and Japan, both on rules as well as market access. However, given the ongoing strength and importance of our relationship with Japan, there may be other issues and opportunities which could further improve our bilateral economic relationship, as well as assist business and industry to undertake trade and investment between our two countries. We value Japan's cooperation to facilitate a closer trade relationship and believe that significant outcomes are possible from the General Review if we both focus on the opportunities of developing closer economic ties. Such opportunities could include enhanced cooperation in a range of areas. For example, in energy and resources, including renewable energy, and I note, of course, we are already strong partners in the energy and resources sectors, in the digital economy, in science and technology, sustainable agriculture, tourism, education and training, and professional services. So they're just some of the areas that we have identified as being capable of further enhancement of our close economic ties. The government will carry out the JAEPA General Review in a way that takes account of the views of business and other stakeholders, just as we do with all of our FTA negotiations. And that is why I'm so pleased to be able to speak with you today. The AJBCC is one of the key business voices driving the Australia and Japan trade and investment relationship. And it is for that reason that we would very much welcome your written submissions, as I've mentioned. And we would appreciate your assistance in spreading the word on the General Review to your members and colleagues. So we look forward to hearing from you on how JAEPA could be improved to assist your business activities. And once again, I urge you to make a written submission through the DFAT JAEPA website, or indeed, we also value close interaction either through email contact or indeed through one-on-one contact via phone if you would like to discuss with us further the details of the General Review or indeed to make suggestions. So thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with you all today. As I said, this is the first time I've had the occasion to speak with you, but I hope it will not be the last. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Elisabeth. I'm going to come back to a couple of points that you made there after we hear from Brett. There's some interesting discussion points there. But let me introduce Brett first. Brett has literally just returned to Australia and is joining us actually from hotel quarantine over in Perth today. Brett just finished up his posting in Tokyo, where he was the General Manager for Northeast Asia for Austrade, where he looked after the Trade Commissioner network in Tokyo, Seoul, Osaka, and Ulaanbaatar. Brett joined Austrade back in 2011 and was appointed Senior Trade Commissioner for Korea. Before joining Austrade, Brett worked as a Senior Advisor in the International Division at the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and was posted to the Australian Embassy in the Netherlands, and then worked in the United States and Australia as a management consultant for McKinsey and Bain. Brett was a recipient of the Korean government scholarship program and graduated from Seoul National University Law Faculty with a Masters of International Law, and was also a recipient of the Japanese government scholarship program, completing his Bachelor of Law at Kobe University in Japan. He's a fluent Japanese and Korean speaker. Brett, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you also to the AJBCC for the opportunity to speak today from hotel quarantine. As Elisabeth just outlined, JAEPA has been really an instrumental agreement in underpinning the bilateral trade relationship. And when it came into force in 2015, it was at the time the most liberalising agreement that Japan had ever signed with any country at that point in time. The landscape is now a little different because Japan has, of course, signed FTAs with EU. It's entered into the CPTPP, and of course there are other trade architecture agreements in place. So the competitive landscape is quite different to what it was in 2015, which of course underpins the need for a periodic review to ensure that JAEPA remains relevant. But it is still a very, very strong agreement and a highly comprehensive one. And it still puts Australian businesses in a very competitive position across a broad range of sectors. I'll start briefly with the food and beverage sector because that was probably the most comprehensive sector that was covered by JAEPA. And it of course gave us some fantastic outcomes across all the bulk commodities and a lot of processed food that Australia exports to Japan. beef, grain, seafood, and horticulture. This is important because the Japanese market is a huge one, roughly about a $800 billion market for food and agri, and of course split into retail and then the food service sector. Probably the retail represents the vast bulk, 70 to 80% of the food and agri market in Japan. And I'm pleased to say that our firms have a very strong presence, particularly in the commodity space, but also through JAEPA in the processed food space as well. It's important to remember the disruption that COVID has had on our trade. And so even though JAEPA has delivered us quite tremendous competitive advantage, the disruption that COVID's having on trade and supply chains, and of course the increased competitive dynamic in Japan means that we really cannot take for granted the strong market position that we do hold in Japan across a range of sectors. So this again reinforces, I think, the need for the business community to really engage strongly with the DFAT in this upcoming review to ensure that JAEPA continues to evolve and meet the needs of business. Japan, some of the fundamentals, despite COVID, of course, haven't changed in Japan. Particularly in food and beverage, it remains a very mature, sophisticated, demanding market. Japanese consumers are increasingly price conscious because the country has experienced stagnant growth for many, many years now. And so when you're sort of looking at a consumer base that is increasingly concerned about health, that is increasingly aged and is quite rattled by the psychological impact of the pandemic, we're seeing a lot of increase in demand for things like functional food and natural foods. And of course, JAEPA does provide quite significant benefits for many of those sub-product categories. Things like fruits and vegetables, fresh horticulture, of course, this is all demand's holding up quite strongly for these products in the current environment. But again, I just reinforce the need to, as an exporter, really double down on the relationships and ensure that, to the best of your ability, I guess, in this current virtual world, that your Japanese partners are seeing you as a committed, reliable supplier to the market. We have heard from many of our Japanese importers and wholesalers, particularly in the F&B space, that there had been some, I guess, pulling back from the Japanese market over the last 5 years, particularly with the very strong growth in China and other places around the world. And we're seeing, of course, a lot of those players trying to re-enter the Japanese market and take advantage of JAEPA again. Once you leave the market, it is a difficult place to break back into, particularly in the food and beverage space, but also in other sectors. So I just encourage anyone on the call who is actually in this food and beverage sector, that if you do have a foothold in the market, it's not a place that you can enter and then pull out because once, in terms of short-term strategy, because it is very, very difficult to re-establish those relationships and re-establish your presence. Particularly with the increased competitive dynamic from the US, from the EU. I'll talk very briefly about the education sector because JAEPA also did give us some guaranteed market access for Australian education providers. Before the pandemic hit, we were seeing exceptionally strong growth in our education market and exports to Japan. And the last set of data we have prior to the pandemic shows we had about a $400 million export market of education service exports to Japan in 2020. We had around 12,000 students coming from Japan to Australia in 2020. And remember, this is off a very, very low base. And much of this growth was due to the Japanese government investing in programs to support universities to send Japanese students overseas. And the driver for that, of course, is the Japanese corporates who realised that they need better English and global skills to remain competitive. So despite Japan being a very mature partner of Australia, the education market over the last several years prior to the pandemic has looked like the profile of a developing country market for us, in the sense that it's shown very, very strong growth. Now, with the pandemic, of course, that growth has stopped, but we are in a very strong position once borders reopen for Japanese students to start re-engaging with Australia. And I think our success in containing the pandemic is well noted and well understood in Japan, and we're often held up in the media as an example of best practice in terms of containment. There's also a strong sense that we remain a safe place to send students to. So I'm pretty confident once borders reopen and the economy normalises, we'll see that resumption of strong growth in the education sector. I'll touch briefly on financial services because JAEPA, of course, has an entire chapter on financial services. Japan is, of course, one of the largest homes to financial assets in the world in terms of savings. And I think many of the people on the call today will be very familiar with the asset management story in Japan, which has seen and continues to see very strong growth. Of course, underpinned by JAEPA, which has allowed Australian financial services providers to establish or acquire institutions in Japan and establish, to a degree, a branch or subsidiary in that sector. A couple of emerging areas that are of interest in Japan at the moment is fintech. I think the Japanese financial sector prior to the pandemic was very analog in many areas. Then you only need to walk into a Japanese retail bank branch to have that experience, how analog it was. But of course, the pandemic has accelerated an enormous shift towards digital. And so fintech is becoming a very, very significant growth sector in the economy in Japan. And the Yano Research Institute, one of Japan's top think tanks, they're predicting an $11 billion market within a couple of years, which is really quite extraordinary growth. So that would be an area that we'd encourage Australian fintech players to look at. Many of our fintech players tend to go to the US or Europe for their first sort of foray overseas. But once you get beyond the language barrier, Japan actually has a lot of demand for these sorts of products. So I'd encourage any participants on the call today to explore Japan, and JAEPA does provide for a significant amount of support there. And finally, blockchain as well is starting to get some traction in the financial services area in Japan. And so, again, if there are any participants on the call, I'd encourage you to reach out to our team in Tokyo. We can certainly hook you up with some opportunities there. I'll finish very briefly by talking about three other sectors which have shown very strong growth in the last several years, not necessarily covered by JAEPA, but perhaps could be the basis of some exploratory discussions by people on the call if you wish to pursue those. The defence industry opportunity in Japan has really grown from nothing over the last 5 years, and we have now a very good profile and excellent prospects for working with Japanese companies on defence solutions. I think it's a safe thing to say that we probably are the preferred security partner in Japan after its alliance partner with the United States. So we're in a very good position in terms of our market presence in the defence sector. JAEPA doesn't explicitly cover that, of course. However, there may be some provisions in JAEPA which might be applicable to your specific product if you have something in the defence sector that you're looking at. Finally, on investment, again, JAEPA provides, there are many different provisions in JAEPA which support inwards investment into Australia from Japan. But I just note the clean energy story is really starting to get serious momentum with Australia. Japan has committed to net zero emissions by 2050. And in April this year, Prime Minister Suga made a commitment to a reduction of 46% CO2 by 2030. That is very significant because what that means is that this is now a problem for Japanese companies now, not in 5 years or 10 years. And so what we're seeing is a lot of Japanese companies engaged in Australia really starting to accelerate their their renewable energy investments and really start to accelerate their strategies of investment there. So I think this area is going to be very, very strong growth. And fortunately, Australia is well positioned to take advantage of this interest from Japanese companies because of our history of supplying energy over 5 decades, our proximity, our political security, and of course, Japanese companies are already heavily invested in energy in Australia, so they know our strengths. So I think this area I'd just like to highlight very briefly as one of tremendous growth potential in the next several years. I might stop there and hand back to Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. Certainly some food for thought there. I can see that we've got at least one question there in the Q&A. So if anybody does have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A for me and I'll do my best to get to them. Before I jump into a couple of questions that I've got for both Brett and Elisabeth from what they said, I did want to just make a couple of observations about our trade with Japan and particularly our export trade. So as Elisabeth mentioned, Japan is our second largest goods export destination. And in fact, our goods exports to Japan are nearly double our next biggest customer, South Korea, at $23 billion, and then the US following that at $19 billion. So it is a significant export market for us. But unsurprisingly, there are 3 large commodities which make up 72% of our exports. That's the iron ore, coal, and natural gas. And that percentage mix is pretty well unchanged over the past decade or so. In 2008, the big 3 commodities, as I've called them, were worth about $36 billion in export revenue to Australia, and in 2020 they were worth $32 billion. So actually we've seen a decrease in our main exports over that period of time, albeit, as Brett mentioned, global trade did take a significant hit in 2020 as a consequence of COVID. And so we would ordinarily expect, everything else being equal, those numbers perhaps to have been slightly lower anyway. But if we look at the mix there, that this is largely due to a nearly halving of our exports of coal to Japan. And that's been partly offset by the growth in natural gas, but not fully. But the remainder of our trade with Japan is characterized by fairly flat to lower numbers, and at best, in some areas, modest growth. Wine is an example. You know, we've lost a $1.3 billion market in China, but our exports of wine to Japan are roughly the same today as they were in 2008. And as Brett talked about, the services, students, tourists, you can go through a number of different sectors. I think it's pretty fair to say that our exports to Japan are below where they could be and probably should be in the future. And this is a good opportunity, a good point in our relationship, I think, for Australian business to think about Japan as a potential export destination and how we can best take advantage of the market that Japan offers. So I'm going to ask my first question to Brett, and then I'll come to a question from the audience for Elisabeth. But the first question to Brett, just given what we've talked about, the opportunities that exist, what is it that you think, Brett, is it that holds Australian businesses back from tackling the Japan market as the opportunity that I think, you know, many of us see?
It's a good question. I think it depends on the sector, of course, and each sector is very different in terms of the characteristics. I think the China story has been really part of this because, well, let's take wine, for example. It's been relatively easy for many wine exporters to make a lot of money in China over the last several years before, of course, the current blockage of trade. And the numbers are compelling, right? I mean, as you said, we've exported well over $1 billion to China before the current trade was stopped. And that's over 20 times what the Japanese market is. So I think that's part of the story as to why we haven't seen as many Australian companies look at the Japanese market, because it is not a high growth market in most sectors. And the allure of China, I think, has drawn many exporters there first. You know, it's a little bit trite to talk about it, but the language barrier, I think, is significant. Many firms in Australia, when they look at overseas expansion, they'll look at the US or they'll look at Europe, where the regulatory systems are, you know, broadly similar and there's no language barrier or very minimal language barrier. I think, look, it really depends, but there's a multitude of factors at play there. There's a lingering perception, which I think is incorrect, that Japan is a very difficult market to break into. Of course, it's challenging, but, you know, in my view, I don't think it's any more challenging than you know, some markets in the US or other places around the world. The fundamentals all still apply, but that perception still lingers. So, I mean, all we can do, I guess, is to encourage colleagues and businesses to take another look at the market. It is a good time to look at it, but of course, you're not going to get high growth in most sectors simply because of the declining population and the stagnant economy. But if you pick your battle carefully, there is still good money to be made in Japan, for sure.
Thanks, Brett. So Elisabeth, the next question's for you. And actually two questions we have from both Peter Gray and Bruce Miller. And they're driving at similar sorts of ideas. So I might just put both of them together for you as one question and let you have a few words to say on this topic. So the question is, should and will the JAEPA review extend to identify new areas where we could deepen and broaden the economic integration between Australia and Japan? So, for example, dealing with impediments to labour movements, tax obstacles, regulatory impediments, financial services. So is there an appetite to be ambitious rather than incremental? And sort of along the same lines, like, do we expect the main focus and outcomes to be just around the rules, or do we aim to improve market access for specific products and sectors?
Thanks very much, Andrew, and thank you to Peter and Bruce for those questions. Particularly nice to see Peter online, at least through the questions. In terms of the aims for the review, certainly we, Australia, do have ambitions for examining and upgrading the rules. Now, I would note that we can already build upon outcomes that we achieved in CPTPP in particular, which represented in some respects upgrade to rules that we have bilaterally with many of our partners, but also through RCEP. So there have been some improvements already in our bilateral relationship in terms of rules, but I think bilaterally there is certainly appetite to look at areas such as the digital economy. I mentioned in the context of Singapore, we concluded a digital economy agreement, which essentially is an upgrade to our e-commerce chapter in the Singapore-Australia Free Trade Agreement. One of the advantages or outcomes of that upgrade was to extend the rules on cross-border data flows and data localization that were contained in the CPTPP or TPPPP at the time to financial services. So that is one area where I think that we could be ambitious and benefit a key sector that that Brett highlighted, which is financial services and fintech. So certainly we will be examining, and this is where the input of stakeholders such as the members of the AJBCC would be very welcome, examining areas where we can upgrade the rules to reflect the realities now of our increased trade and economic ties, but also the regional reality in which we are working. In terms of other areas, so specifically taxation, FTAs don't generally address issues of taxation. Sometimes those issues are considered alongside FTAs, but that is not something that we would generally examine in an FTA. But certainly other issues, including movement of natural persons or labour mobility and addressing regulatory barriers to trade, are areas, potential areas, where if there is mutual ambition, we could examine improvements to the rules. So once again, we do welcome identification of specific barriers that could be addressed through this review process. In terms of market access, I didn't mention, but there is in fact already an ongoing market access review, albeit a fairly limited market access review, which started in 2020 and considers an improvement in market access conditions for around 132 agricultural tariff lines. Now, that review is being undertaken in parallel with this general review. We did have a call for submissions last year, and we received about 20 submissions in that process. So we are engaging with Japan on that very targeted and specific market access review at the same time as we are conducting the general review. I think it's important to note the context for that market access review, as well as for any broader market access review that we might consider as part of the general review. And that is, of course, the outcomes of the CPTPP did include some improved market access for some of our commodities. And those outcomes built upon the JAEPA outcomes. So in some areas, we have already benefited from improved market access under the CPTPP. That doesn't mean that we can't consider, and in fact, we are considering areas of other improved market access conditions, particularly for those 132 agricultural tariff lines. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Elisabeth. So the next question that we've got from Okayama-san, the first part of it may be a little bit tricky to answer, but I do want to just ask the question and lead into the second part of it. So the question was, do you see potential for development of emissions trading market in Australia by way of voluntary contributions from industries or under the government's auspices? And what opportunities for collaboration with Japan in this space? And I guess, you know, hydrogen is something that comes to mind for me in that arena. I'm not sure, Elisabeth or Brett, if you have any sort of thoughts about perhaps how, you know, Australia might develop the relationship with Japan, particularly in these alternate energy markets.
I'll have a crack at that, Andrew. Look, I'll defer the question on the emissions trading market perhaps to DFAT colleagues who are closer to the domestic energy policy. But as I said earlier, Japanese companies are now really scrambling, in my view, to accelerate their decarbonisation strategies. Japan's a very carbon-intensive economy, heavy manufacturing sector, and a lot of demand for electricities. Of course, we supply close to half of all Japan's energy, and that's primarily coal and it's LNG. When 2011, the Fukushima disaster happened, of course, Japan shut its nuclear reactor capacity down overnight, and at that time was close to a third of the country's electricity capacity. There is, in my view, almost no chance that all of that capacity will be brought back online again. And so Japan, over the last 10 years, has shifted very heavily into LNG and heavily reliant on coal. So with Prime Minister Abe's announcement of 46% reduction by 2030, that's a serious target for corporate Japan, which are heavily exposed to carbon intensive sectors through their investments in Australia, of course, globally as well. So the big trading houses, the banks, the power generators, they are all looking at how to, decarbonise by 2050 and, of course, by 2030 in particular. So Australia looms large in that calculation simply because of our current position, but because we are, we have the benefits of all the ingredients necessary to provide renewable energy to Japan. And the hydrogen story, of course, is the front of the queue in terms of the technologies that are able to do that. Everyone on the call will be familiar with the HESC project in the Latrobe Valley, which is converting lignite brown coal into liquefied hydrogen. The consortia being led by KHI, which will this year ship its first pilot shipment of liquefied hydrogen from that project to Japan. That, of course, is not the only project. There are around 40 projects in hydrogen currently under development in Australia. Many of those have got interest from Japanese companies looking to, accelerate their decarbonisation. So the Latrobe Valley projects are most prominent, but there are many, many other opportunities as well for Japanese investors. So I think it's a tremendously exciting time. I think within 10 years, this will be the new pillar of the bilateral trade and investment relationship. I think hydrogen will be probably the core of that new relationship in 10 years' time.
Okay, Brett, thank you. Look, I'm afraid we've run out of time, and we do like to close these things on time. I know there's a part of that question we didn't quite get to answer, and there is another question in the Q&A function which we won't have time to get to. It is from an anonymous participant, so if you'd like to just let us know exactly who you are, we will get back to you with an answer on that question. So let me finish up by thanking both Elisabeth and Brett. You've been very generous with your insight and comments, so we really appreciate both your time and insights. We could, of course, talk all morning and probably all afternoon about these topics. There's this huge opportunity for Australia in Japan, and I think given the current circumstances that we find ourselves in, there's never been a better time for us to push forward with that relationship and to explore the Japanese market. And I would encourage everybody to think about Elisabeth's request for submissions into this JAEPA review, because if we don't have our say as a business community, then we can't really expect the government to make the changes that we'd like to see. So please make those submissions. So with that, I'm going to finish up and hand over to Rod, who's going to wrap up the session. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks to Elisabeth and Brett. As you say, Andrew, rightly, this is a topic that looms large in our collective minds, and we could talk about it for longer. But importantly, it's an opportunity, I think, for us as the AJBCC to have direct input into the process. One of the things I really like about the AJBCC is we've always worked in an entirely appropriate and close way with the DFAT seniors in this space, and that's been reciprocated. So, Elisabeth, thanks for your contribution. Brett, welcome back again, and I really look forward to catching up again soon when you're out of quarantine and you manage to make your way from the west to the east coast. But thanks, everybody, and let's keep pressing. Cheerio.